He's been waiting to get there a long time. He wants to take over the rest of it.
You think they'll let him in?
Think he'll live for?
You think well, that's their question. You think they'll let him in?
Well, I don't know. I'd be very surprised if he makes it anywhere.
That's sort of I know. You know, Mubarak's got a Beverly Hills option. I don't think Gaddafi has that. Because most Arizona might.
I heard there was. I think they're from a lot of places. There was a Nigerian that was captured, I think.
Interesting.
But yeah.
It's a very dodgy situation because there's being racial violence.
Oh,
Yes,
absolutely.
Absolutely.
Anyway, so we are. I think we should start with the great honor of welcoming Joe Powell to Duke and Center for African and African American Research, the Department of African and African American Studies, the Duke Islamic Studies Center, and the Department of History are all involved in making this possible. So we thank all of them. Joe Powell is a historian of Egypt and Sudan. I think that's the right way to describe you. She's the author of a very influential book called A Different Shade of Colonialism, Egypt, Great Britain, and the Mastery of Sudan. It was published in 2003 by the University of California Press. And this is a book which looks at the ways in which Egyptians who were involved in a colonial project in the Sudan in the 19th century, how they developed their own racial language to talk about the Sudanese in Sudan, and also how that idea of race was deployed back home in Egypt. So this is a book which has been extremely influential for me. I've used it in classes. I feel like I know it very well. A great book. And also a book that she co-edited and compiled with John Hunwick, a series of sources essentially translated into English, called The African Diaspora in the Mediterranean Lands of Islam from 2002, which has a whole series of texts having to do with slavery, race, and other things about Africans, the people of sub-Saharan African descent in North Africa and the Mediterranean world, which is really a unique source, something I also use in a number of classes. She's the recipient of, she's a MacArthur Fellow from 2003. So she's a professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania. And I'm going to have a bit of a disjointed introduction here, but we're very happy to welcome you here today and to talk about the work that you're currently doing. So I'd like everybody to join me in welcoming you, Joe Powell.
Thank you all very, very much. I am just delighted to be here. I've been in North Carolina before. I've never been to Duke. And although I have good friends here at Duke, and so I want to thank you all for bringing me. I particularly, though, have to thank Bernice Patterson, who has made my trip not only easy, but delightful. So you're lucky to have her. And the Center for Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania should always be a place to be, Bernice. Okay? You can train them there, all right? The essay that I'm presenting today is a chapter in the new book that I am almost done with, and it's taken longer than having a child and raising a child, but this will be born. And this is out of a book that I'm exploring slave narratives and slave owners' narratives to sort of get at the experience of slavery from the Nile Valley, from Sudan through the Nile Valley, up through Egypt, up into Ottoman Turkey, and especially in Istanbul. So that's the map I'm trying to verbally create here. And the name of this talk, this is a talk about two very important women out to sea, and it is called Hoda, Hadide, and the Slaves at Bedtime. And so I'll just launch into it. I have a very, very simple PowerPoint, so just bear with me. Anyway, these are the two women about whom I'm speaking of, and this is them in their older years. And I'll begin with a quote. And okay, this is from Hoda Sha'arawi. This is from her memoirs, in which she says, "I used to imagine that I was not my mother's daughter, that my real mother was a slave girl who had died, and the truth was being withheld from me. Firmly convinced of this, I suffered all the more. I would keep everything suppressed until nightfall, but as soon as I laid my head on the pillow, I was overcome by anxieties, and frightening thoughts moved me to tears." And this is Hoda as a young woman. Now, the next quote I don't have on the screen, but if you'll just bear with me, I think you'll hear some of the similarities. This is from Halide Adivar's memories. And she writes, "The woman whom she calls mother is lying in semi-darkness beside her in a large bed, clad in her white gown. There are those long, silky plaits which seem to coil with the life of some mysterious coiling animals, and that small, pale face with its unusually long, curly black lashes, resting on the sickly pallor of the drawn cheeks. This mother is a thing of mystery and uneasiness to the little girl. She is afraid of her, she is drawn to her, and yet that thing called affection has not taken shape in her heart. There is only a painful sense of dependence on this mother, who is quietly fading out from the background of her life." So by the time Hoda Sha'arawi described how haunted she had been as a child by the idea that her imagined slave mother had died, she was a powerful figure in the Egyptian nationalist movement, a middle-aged woman with her own grown children, and an internationally recognized leader of the women's rights movement in Egypt. Her strong political and nationalist voice made her a figure that for decades dominated articles in the Egyptian press. And I'll show you one example. She was one of the leaders of the 1919 Egyptian Revolution. It's nice to be able to show yet another example of an Egyptian revolution, in which nationalist leaders were exiled to Malta for daring to ask the British colonial administration for passports to go plead their case for independence of the League of Nations. And the wives of these exiled leaders and others, and these are elite women, as you can tell from their veils, they were the ones who organized much of this institution. And Hoda Sha'arawi, who was the wife of one of these leaders, this is what propelled her into the national spotlight from which she never stepped back. By the time Halide Adivar wrote down her memoirs of her sickly mother, whose chronic illnesses left her daughter to be nursed by slave wet nurses, she too was a powerful figure in the Turkish nationalist movement that would eventually and successfully replace the Ottoman government after World War I. When she wrote her memoirs in 1926, Halide was a self-exiled, twice-married mother of three, a best-selling novelist who had been an activist spokesperson for the Young Turk Revolution, Young Turk Revolution nationalist politicians, and who eventually would become a member of the Turkish parliament, the first woman to become a member of the Turkish parliament. This is her with one of the leaders of the triumvirate that led the Ottoman Empire into World War I. Unfortunately, she's standing next to the man who sided with Germany, and this sped up the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. But her, even though she was exiled soon after that, she came back and was a big, huge force in the creation of the Republic of Turkey. Both women were born into highly privileged families during the period in the late 19th century in which massive political and cultural change would alter the traditions that shaped women's education, marriages, and their public lives. Slaves were an integral and intimate part of their childhoods, and many vivid experiences that both Halide and Hoda remembered about the slaves with whom they had grown up shaped their vision of what maturity and independence should mean for themselves and for the women of their country. So this part is called Family Connections. Hoda Sha'arawi was famous enough by the 1920s that photographs, even caricatures of her image were published in many newspapers. As Beth Barron has shown, increasingly vocal and politicized Egyptian women leaders struggled with the control of their images in the press, and Hoda was arguably the most famous and visible of them all. Given the sensitivity to slavery that she later revealed in her memoirs, it is interesting to see Hoda caricatured in the following way in the popular political magazine called El Kashkul, which means the notebook in Arabic. So I hope you can, with the lights on, can you see that? It's sort of important that you see that. There you go. Okay. So this is Hoda right here, and this is a figure called El Bash Agha, all right? Okay.
Should I
Okay.
keep them a bit dim?
That's fine.
This is fun.
Can you all see? Yes, okay, all right. So this cartoon is entitled in Arabic, Where is Independence? And refers to a fraught political confrontation over Egypt's nominal independence between Egyptian nationalist politicians, the monarchy, and the British. The caption, which is not here, at the feet of Hoda Hanam Sha'rawi and Bash Agha, begins with his asking, and he asked this in colloquial Egyptian Arabic, "My lady, if there is no independence for those men, what will they do?" And Hoda answers, "Listen, O Bash Agha, as long as there is a nation that wants independence, don't be afraid. You're more of a man than all of them." Now, the joke here is that, as El Kashkol's readers would have immediately understood, is that El Bash Agha was a eunuch and had been a slave in the household in which Hoda grew up. Beth Barron points us towards the emasculating irony with which the caricatured Hoda states that this eunuch is more of a man than the leading politicians of Egypt's nationalist Waqt party. But the picture reveals another, perhaps less intentional irony as well. Under the title, Where is Independence? Istiklal Fame, stands a remarkably outspoken Egyptian woman with a slave who had been part of her household since childhood, who had, as this will discuss more in depth, helped raise Hoda since her babyhood and stood with her, was satirized alongside her well into her adulthood. Said Aga, as she called him in her memoirs, his real name, played a pivotal role in her observations about slavery in Egyptian society, and yet he remained with her as she matured into a national public figure. We can assume that his role in her life changed after her marriage and the births of her children, but his connection to her household did not. How does this slave, this companion, accompany the dramatic trajectory of this groundbreaking woman's life? Could he do so independently? How did this leader of the Egyptian women's movement negotiate the distance between the childhood nightmares of the mother's enslavement and the constant loyal service of a slave her entire life? Although by the turn of the century, Egypt and the wider Ottoman Empire were no longer as united politically or economically as they had been a century before, the domestic cultures of the two regions were deeply connected and in massive flux. As they moved up the socio-economic ladder of opportunities created by the secular schools and institutions of Muhammad Ali, who was one of the Ottoman governors of Egypt in the early 19th century, a generation of men, like Hoda Sha'rawi's father, often chose to marry Turkish-speaking women or to purchase Circassian women as concubines, a practice they shared with the Turkish-speaking elite counterparts in cities like Istanbul. In the late 19th century, when the children of these unions were born, this upper-class Ottoman Egyptian household, one of the most important social formations, and I'm quoting Beth Barron, this unraveled. Harem slavery dwindled dramatically, in part due to the consequences of abolition, but arguably due more to the rise of nationalism and the powerful idea, that, as Beth Barron writes, foreign-born slave mothers could not be entrusted with raising good patriots. Beth continues, the new nation could not be built on households that included harem slaves from the Caucasus, retainers from Central Asia, concubines from Ethiopia, eunuchs from Africa, and patriarchs from Anatolia or the Balkans. The Circassian slaves and their descendants would be absorbed into the new elite, Muslim, Coptic, or Jewish, grounded in Egyptian territory. The transition from empire to nation-state was reflected on the micro level as large multi-ethnic households were reconstituted as models for the nation. As men like Muhammad Sultan Pasha, Hoda's father, merged with the Ottoman Egyptian elite through marriage and concubinage, Ottoman Egyptians also merged with a changing Egyptian political landscape, where leaders spoke eloquently of Egypt for the Egyptians by 1882. Hoda Sha'rawi was thus not only the daughter of an immensely privileged family, but also a figure who bridged this very transition from the multi-ethnic Ottoman Egyptian household to bourgeois and monogamous family life. Although the politically and historical significance of the transition of the Egyptian family is clearly shown by Beth Barron's careful research and analysis, this transition was difficult, often polarizing, and always deeply felt. Nor was it always cut and dry, as the Kashkul caricature of Hulda shows. This symbol of the activist and modern Egyptian woman could never quite escape her close connection to slavery. In many ways, this transition also occurred in the late Ottoman Empire, where a growing politicized awareness of Turkish identity also studied carefully the position of women in marriage and family. Halide, too, like Hoda, stood directly on top of this cultural fault line and wrote about it. Thank God they wrote about it. That's one of the nice things about this, that they thought so carefully about it. Both women share childhoods greatly structured by slaves and the rituals of the slave trade. Both Hoda and Halide grew up in environments where the presence and the work of slaves were as elemental and as comfortable as furniture. The work and presence of slaves helped to define and articulate these elites' sense of home, not only in its physical structure, but also the traditions of family structure that bound these Sudanese servants to them. But it is important to note that Hoda Shadawi and Halide Adivar internalized this relationship with slavery differently than some of the male slave owners who I discuss in other points in the book. They were more connected to an even broader network of slaves because of their connections to both Sudan and also to the Caucasus. This was the case for Hoda Shadawi, whose household as a child was made up of slaves and servants from Sudan and from the Caucasus, and sometimes from the Balkans, and whose own mother came from a group of people intimately connected with Circassian slavery. Nor was it similar to Halide's upbringing, and as we shall see, her constant vigilance against being told that she looked like a slave or that her personality came from blood ties to slaves. Right? You think about that for a minute. Okay, excuse me. Hoda's memoirs are a fascinating account of her struggle against the constraints of her childhood and her protest against the premises upon which Egyptian upper-class households were both structured and idealized in the late 19th century. She was a careful observer of her society and acutely aware of limitations facing Egyptian and Ottoman women. She followed closely debates about the status of women in Egyptian society, and in turn of the century Egypt, this debate often equated their circumstances with those of slaves. Sorry.
That's okay. Take your time.
This chapter is also going to examine how Hoda protested these conditions for her own life, but not necessarily that of the slaves with whom she was raised, particularly Said Aga. One almost wishes that she and Halide could have compared their notes and memories so vividly do both women remember their slaves. Okay, I'm going to, this part is called Was My Real Mother a Slave? As we have seen above, Hoda was haunted by the fantasy that she was not the daughter of the mother she knew, but of a slave girl who had died. Excuse me. What circumstances could have frightened this privileged little girl into such a sad dream? In 1879, Hoda was born into the wealthiest strata of Egyptian society, and consequently into a social network in which Circassian slave women were often concubines, wives and mothers to very affluent children. These parts of Egyptian society were intimately connected to the elites of Ottoman society. As Ebru Toledano has written about Cairo and Istanbul in the mid-19th century, members of the prominent households in both cities were linked to one another by family relations or through social networking. Some of that social networking about which he talks also included slaves and selling slaves. The children of these communities, especially those born in the same year as Hoda, in 1879, shared many connections of ethnicity through genealogical inheritances from Ottoman, Circassian, and Sudanese slavery. As Beth Barron noted about Hoda's female and political contemporaries in Egypt, Hoda's mother was Circassian. Munira Thabits was Turkish. Fatima, otherwise known as Rosa Yusuf, her parents were Syrian, and Esther Wisas were Copts. Their own family backgrounds and political trajectories show the transition from Ottoman households with slaves and ex-slaves to Egyptian families. Hoda's mother was a concubine, and a Sudanese eunuch presided over the harem. Esther grew up in a household run by a Sudanese ex-slave, daughter of a chieftain. A generation earlier, thousands of young women the age of Hoda's mother were brought from the regions of the Caucasus to the largest cities of the Ottoman Empire as slaves to be sold. If these young women were fortunate enough to be sold to wealthy families, they stood the chance to be educated well and to be well maintained. If they bore children to their masters or husbands, their position was enhanced legally, and they could be manumitted and gain rights towards inheritance. Their lives in the harem, the rooms in the household where they were segregated from unrelated men, intrigued Western travelers and readers in the 19th century, who romanticized the daily lives of these white Circassian women much more than they did the drudgery of African slaves working, often in the same chambers. But there was often little romance to the challenges faced by these women in a time when they could exert very little control of their sexual and reproductive lives. This is a picture that was taken. I'm sorry, in Harper's Review. That was printed in Harper's Review in, I believe, 1876, showing a Circassian woman who is being sort of menaced down there by a supposedly Muslim slave dealer, but just some guy from the Caucasus. We don't know. It was a very complicated situation, and one that was covered very with great detail by the Ottoman press, the Egyptian press, and especially the British press. This really captured people's imagination, and there was a romanticization of the positions of these women. I think you can see a quality of that in sort of the pale sort of beauty surrounded by darkness of this young woman's face.
Who's being menaced? I can't see that.
No, should we turn it off just for a little bit? She is.
Oh.
Well, they are, but she is the focal point of the menace.
Oh, I see.
Right. Yeah. Can you all see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. Okay. So, Hoda Sharawi's mother, Iqbal, would have understood the very unromantic details of this kind of voyage. In fact, as Hoda wrote, her mother confronted sorrow and depression through much of her adult life. That was probably part of the trauma she experienced when she was a teenager, when she was forced to make a difficult, terrible trek from the Caucasus to Egypt during her adolescence. The decade between 1854 and 1864, when Hoda's mother would have been quite young, marked a period of political terror and economic disaster for many of the ethnic groups of the Caucasus, where Iqbal was born. This vastly multi-ethnic region had long been, as we know, a major provider of slaves for the Ottoman Empire. And as Lyubov Derlugian writes, the Caucasus was the world-renowned source of male and female slaves employed for concubinage and sexual services. Hoda Sharawi's mother came from a politically important family in the Caucasus, and so would undoubtedly have been familiar with a world in which, economically, slaves were also a universal measure of exchange. This was a system in which there were different kinds of slaves, those kept in the household who eventually achieved this form of belonging and acceptance into the family, and those who had virtually no sense of status or identity, and I'm quoting Derlugian here, were probably prisoners of war and were strangers to the family who held them and to the society of that family. Hoda's mother, Iqbal, may have been aware as a young child of the raids that many nobles of the Caucasus launched against each other, with devastating results for many villages. Certainly, she was an eyewitness to the more serious wars that broke out between ethnic groups in the region towards the middle of the 1850s. During this period, Russia began to exert more control over the region, sometimes as a force of abolition and often as an expansionist empire. Torn between affinities with the Ottoman Empire and the promises of political strength extended by Russia, the nobility of the Caucasus found itself under increasing political and economic pressure until some broke out in full-fledged rebellion against Russian attempts to solidify its control. Hoda's grandfather, the father of her mother, was a leader in one of these revolts. As the details she painstakingly included in her memoirs show, it was important for Hoda to understand her mother's origins and how her mother began her life in the Caucasus yet ended up in Egypt. What we know of Iqbal's journey came to Hoda from her maternal uncle, Iqbal's brother, Yusuf, who told her of the war that erupted between Russia and the Caucasus in 1860, in which he and his sister's grandfather, Hoda's great-grandfather, fought against the Russians, but lost his regiment and was taken prisoner. I won't go into all of the details because she gives a lot of pages to this. But anyway, he was killed. The great-grandfather was killed, and Hoda's grandmother, Iqbal and Yusuf's mother, fled the Caucasus with her 5 children, following thousands of other emigres on well-worn paths to Istanbul. Hungry and anxious, they waited at the border for months as the overwhelmed Ottoman authorities sorted out their status and, according to the family, took their property and their money. And during the long wait, the 2 youngest children died of sickness, and Hoda's grandmother, fearing for the life of her remaining daughter, arranged to send Iqbal to live in Egypt with her uncle. The family entrusted Iqbal's delivery to her uncle and to a friend also on his way to Egypt. But when the pair arrived in Cairo, they discovered that the uncle was in Sudan fighting against troops fighting a war in Sudan, and the uncle's wife refused to claim any connection to this beautiful young Circassian refugee. Iqbal, young and unmarried, was placed in the household of another elite officer to wait for her uncle's arrival. Here, her situation also became difficult. Her position, it was felt, made her too competitive for the attentions of the men, and as Hoda writes, it was good fortune that my father chose her to be his wife. Now, there is actually no proof that Muhammad Sultan Pasha, Hoda's father, married Iqbal, and most historians of Hoda's life consider Iqbal to have been his concubine, a status that often meant that she was a woman he had purchased. Hoda's memoirs contain many details about the difficult passage of her Circassian relatives from the Caucasus, but none about the possibility that her own mother had been sold to her father in Cairo. Instead, she paints a picture of a husband doting on his melancholy wife. Now, I will share that picture that she paints with you. One day, she, this is Iqbal, was helping my father put on his clothes, and it just so happened that she was standing by the window looking out on the park, and she began to weep. My father asked what caused her to cry. She responded that among the visitors waiting in the reception room, there was one who resembled her brother Yusuf, and she couldn't keep herself from crying. Hoda's father, my father asked her about her family and kinsfolk. When she told him her story, he went right away to the household of Ali Bey Rahab, where Iqbal had stayed originally, to get the address of her family. And fortunately, there were relatives present in Egypt. My father prepared the funds to send for the family. He brought them. The meeting was a great joy and deeply affected my mother, who moved into the first house in his compound. Hoda's uncle Yusuf and other relatives soon followed, and my mother was returned again to her family and her relations. Now, Hoda's narrative here reveals several possibilities about her mother's status in the Sultan household. Had she been Muhammad Sultan's social or economic equal, with a strong family of her own in Egypt, the details of her family and her relatives would have been made well known to him during the negotiations for marriage. He does not discover these details until after she has become a member of his house, intimate enough to help him with his clothes, but not with a strong enough standing to deserve her own rooms in the compound, as a wife of greater standing would. And Hoda's father did have a wife, known lovingly to Hoda as al-Kabira, or Big Mama, the first wife, who did have her own apartments. But once Sultan Pasha learned of Iqbal's forced separation from her family, and the story is proven true because he makes sure that it's true, she does rise in status. Certainly the memory of her little girl Hoda, already worried by the fear that her real mother had been a slave. Iqbal succeeded in erasing any traces of slavery or concubinage. Perhaps this work of erasure helped assuage Hoda's bad dreams about slavery. Perhaps these evasive silences protected the social position of Hoda's children. Now, Circassian slavery in the Caucasus remains an understudied topic in the fields of Middle Eastern history or slavery studies. One too large to explore in great detail here, but definitely one worth pursuing. But I linger over its nearness to Hoda's family because from the 1860s to the end of the 19th century, so many writers in Europe and the Middle East bore witness to this forced migration, and they called it a forced migration. Sometimes they called it a middle passage, endured by thousands of people from the Caucasus, many of whom ended up as slaves in Egypt and the Ottoman Empire. Okay, I'm going to skip over that just to talk about how soon the servants seem to have been transformed into slaves as the immigrants continued to pour into Ottoman cities until the late 1870s, and foreign descriptions of the Middle Passage changed into depictions of widespread domestic enslavement. Although terms like Middle Passage were repeatedly used, implicitly comparing the trek of the Circassian refugees to the transatlantic traumatizing voyages of African slaves, Western observers were somewhat ambivalent in their judgment of this burgeoning network of slavery. Images began to circulate of strikingly pale and beautiful Caucasian women fleeing the despotism of Russian imperialism across the mountains of Turkey, like this sketch from Harper's Weekly shows. But we don't really see that same kind of romanticized view of different treks in these same papers, who were very active in the abolition movement in the Nile Valley as well. The only view I can think of, and I should have it here in the presentation, and I don't, but maybe you've seen it, are the sketches that David Livingstone had commissioned for his diaries that he wrote when they were to be the Diaries of Central Africa. When these were published, and they were first published, I believe, by the Royal Geographic Society, he had commissioned he had a photographer with him, and he also had his brother come and do sketches. And they're sketches of Africans being about to be, their throats be, I'm sure you've seen these in some places, and it would probably be good to have it up here. But this is, they are
castrated too.
not in those pictures, not in those pictures. And if you were to be castrated, you would be taken to a special place. That wouldn't happen just on the road, because it took a long time to heal, and why lose all the money, So, okay. So, going from this attention to these slaves, let's talk about other kinds of slaves. Circassian concubines and the sales of young women into slavery in the 1860s and 1870s incited a great deal of attention, both locally and internationally, because of the tragedies of the refugee circumstances. International pressure also caused the trade in African slaves to be made illegal in 1874 in East Africa, in Egypt and Sudan specifically. Slavery itself, however, was not outlawed, and African slaves continued to make up significant parts of the domestic labor force, particularly in wealthy homes like Hoda Sharawi's. In her remembrances of her childhood, Said Aga, the intimate guardian, figures prominently. There are other Sudanese slaves as well who wander through her past life. Almost all of them disappear as her memoirs narrate her adult life. Only a passing reference to Said Aga lets her readers know he accompanied her into adulthood. Okay. Now she loved him, and when she wrote about him with great affection. But she also remembers how he was the person who was in charge. His discipline over her affected her whole view of herself as a young woman. She wanted to learn. She was brought up speaking Turkish and French. She knew a little Arabic, but she knew the Arabic to, tell the servants what to do. She knew like kitchen Arabic. She didn't know. She had some Egyptian dialect, but she didn't know proper classical Arabic. She wanted, and she wanted to learn this. And actually, her tutor said, I'll bring the grammar books and I will show this to you. Okay? And her tutor agreed, and that he would bring books the next day. And when he came, here's an example of Said Aga's discipline. Said Aga asked him, with arrogance and haughtiness, she says, what are those books? The tutor responded, grammar books. As Hoda remembered the scene, the Aga chuckled and then said to the tutor, take your books, there is no need for them, because she is never going to become a lawyer. And Hoda writes, this incident affected me very deeply. Despair penetrated my heart and bitterness seized me to the point where I neglected my studies. I began to hate my femininity because it deprived me of the joys of studying or engaging in the sports that I loved so much, just like it would impede the freedom for which I so yearned. So Said Aga becomes, on this much quoted page from Hoda's very famous and well-translated life, the embodiment of authority that kept women inferior and unfulfilled in Egyptian society. It seemed that he ruled over everything. If Hoda and her brother committed any infraction, the nurses would complain to Said Aga, and he would make the siblings go into the yard, get branches from a tree, and bring them back so that he could beat their palms and leave them crying. Kind of a scene that Richard Pryor when his grandmother made him go get his own switch, you know. And by then, Hoda writes, he would take the but then after they cried, he would take the handkerchiefs out of our pockets and wipe away our tears. And then he would say, you have each made restitution, but beware of doing what you did again. He would threaten them with worse punishments, and then he would, she writes, become a child like us. He played with them, he ran with them, he chased them. She forgot his severity for the most part, but her brother could not. As Hoda remembered, her brother would return to the house after such disciplining and climb up the stairs and hurry to my mother to tell her the news, complaining to her while overwhelmed with tears what the Aga had done, saying, that slave hit me, darabni had al-abid. Said Aga would explain to the mother why the children had deserved punishment, and she would calm her son down, explaining that he is your guardian and he only does it to keep you in check. It took Hoda a while to understand the constraints of Said Aga's life and the limits of his authority, but she remembered that her mother felt a special sympathy for him, which she tried to explain. Said Aga was very proud to serve in this household, and Iqbal understood the source of his pride. It was not only because this was an important and wealthy family, but also because Muhammad Sultan Pasha, Hoda's father, had bought him when he was small and took care of his upbringing, especially in having him educated in school. As Hoda described, Lala Saeed was proud, that's another word for our the head eunuch in the house, kind of. Lala Saeed was proud and disdainful, haughty in his behavior, and very proud of our house. My mother was tender and sympathetic towards him because my father had brought him and had concerned himself with his upbringing and his education in school while he was so small. He loved my father to the point of worship. When he grew up, he directed that love towards us. And my mother appreciated this love for my father and for us later. I also appreciated him and recognized the benefit of his raising us. It had a tremendous influence on me. Okay. I don't want to, I have a lot more to say. I'm going to abridge myself just a little bit because I think this is going forever, right? Right. Okay, so let me just go over this a little bit. I could talk more about him, but I want to describe and I want to get to Hadiday. So let me just, okay. What she learned about discipline from Said Aga, she also learned about submission. When she was forced to marry her cousin, and she finally figured out the wedding was for her, that she was marrying her cousin, and he's much older, she had a real, she physically got sick. She revolted against the whole thing. She was crying, and her mother was so embarrassed that her mother wouldn't come out of her room. And it was Said Aga who went into the room and came and got her and pulled her close and said, whispered in my ear, do you wish to upset the spirit of your father and the condemnation of your sick mother? She in her room collapsed in her bed sick and sobbing. Perhaps she cannot bear the shock if you refuse. These words hit me in my weak spot, Hoda wrote, and Hoda received yet another important life lesson at the hands of Said Aga, how to submit to the arrangements of authority. Now finally, I will leave him here, I will leave Hoda and Said Aga here. Department stores were new to Egypt by the time, in the early 20th century, they were just starting, and the whole entourage with Said Aga goes shopping in downtown Cairo, much to the horror of her mother, but they all go heavily veiled, wrapped up, like she said, they looked ridiculous. And, you know, modern, young, lower-class women are actually working in the store and come up and ask them if they come from a foreign country, okay? And Said Aga lets this young cashier have it. And so Hoda describes just this terrible moment of how he just looks like such an ancient figure, makes them all just look so old-fashioned and terrible, and how awful this was, and sort of casting him back into a time of the past. Now, I want to make clear that there were also women who were slaves who interacted with Hoda and her brother. And I want to talk about this because this is a very important part. Female slaves in Hoda's memory, speak more freely about their past, and I will share this with you. These governesses, maids, and wet nurses who took care of her and her brother had also been with the family since children's birth, and they knew the history of the household's members. In a beautifully described tableau, Hoda mentions tender evenings of storytellings. As for our nights, we used to spend them sitting in little groups around the large lantern because electricity was not yet widely spread in Cairo. Our wet nurses would tell us their stories, how they were enslaved and what their countries of origin had been like, what the customs of the people were like, until we grew sleepy and they would carry us to our beds. Hoda and her brother knew then that these slaves were not indigenous to Egypt, but they had been there so long, had been in the household so long, that the pain of separation from their own families and the memories of their own childhoods had become candlelit stories told and remembered like lullaby folk tales. The voices of the slaves in Hoda's childhood home are just whispers intended to put her to sleep and not meant to be remembered as important stories themselves. They were not part of the family lore. The bond that tied the slaves to Hoda were indeed intimate, but had been forced. They were not stories that imparted a shared cultural past. While I marvel at the very human desire of these Sudanese slaves to voice their stories while putting little Hoda to bed, it makes me sad that she does not give us the stories themselves. But Hoda did attribute one thing to the slaves. She admitted that she learned to tell stories from the narrative gifts of her servants. She admits this when she describes how Sit al-Zahra, the woman who sold rose water and perfume to the house, entertained them. She was tall, with a wide body and round face with dignified features. She always wore white clothes and on her head a white scarf. We loved her a great deal and looked forward to her visits, waiting eagerly to hear her entertaining stories. Because of how much we loved her, we encouraged her to stay as late as possible. We would spend the evening listening while she told in her golden voice her delightful stories. We sat around her, all of our eyes wide and our ears wide open. She went from story to story, and the salon on those evenings was filled with the entire household, who formed a large circle that overflowed out of the door. Afterwards, we'd fall into bed, dreaming of the stories that she had told, entering the world of imagination. I now know that it is because of this gifted woman that our imaginations had life. Again, Hoda does not share these tales with her readers, but instead the sense of intoxication the tales induced. Sid al-Zahra may have been a former slave servant, but certainly was a peddler, which was often a job that the manumitted slaves took on. With the slaves who put Hoda to bed as a child, she taught Hoda how to tell stories, or perhaps to be more honest to say how to tell her own story. Hoda's memories of the slaves' voices set the stage for her own repressed childhood, a truly important story, but one in which others' narratives are only a background. And now my paper is I'm going to move quick, I promise, with Halliday's stories of her bedtime. And Halliday is a very interesting writer. So she also grew up in a household with a male servant who was a eunuch, and her presentation of him and what he meant to her shows the strong similarities she shared with Hoda. Sometimes in these memoirs, which were written actually in English in 1926, Halliday describes her younger self in the third person, as noticeable in this passage, where the servant's body forms the boundary of her life. Ali is the manservant who takes care of her. He is her Lala, that indispensable personage in every old Turkish household, for which there is no English, no European equivalent can exist, where it rose from roots wholly foreign to them, wholly oriental. The Lala was the natural outcome of the marked separation between the indoor and outdoor life of that day and that world. Indoors was the delicate, intimate rule of women. Out of doors was the realm of men. They could play there their proper role of protector, and one felt happy and secure in their presence. As a child, and as a child only, one could share to the full the freedom of the two worlds, and one's Lala was one's natural companion into all the open-air places and experiences. Then, too, he brings with him into memory that je ne sais quoi, the old world service, devotion, attachment, pride, possession even, which the modern Turkish world has forgotten, which made so much the warmth and color of the old household life. So here, too, is a mourning, here like with Hoda Sharawi, is a mourning for the past courtesies based on old patterns of domestic labor. Halliday would have understood Hoda so well and why Hoda admired the quick and prompt way in which Said Aga managed their household. And like Hoda, Halliday remembered as a child fearing that she too was somehow related to slaves, although she does not perform the same obfuscation with her mother's past as Hoda does. But one could inherit a taint of slave status not only through direct parentage, as Halliday describes here. And you all bear with me, okay? It's a rather long quote. It's the worst thing to say before you say it. Bear with me, it's a really long, boring quote. Here's a very exciting quote coming from it. All right. The accusation of having gypsy milk and mixed milk was a common one in those days. As my mother had been too delicate, father had hired wet nurses for me. It was believed that the milk a baby drinks affects its character, making it like the woman who nurses it. My first milk mother, as we call a foster mother, was in Albania, and my sullen moods were put down to her. Granny would say, now it is the milk of that cross Albanian which is working in thee. The next was the wife of an onion seller, a supposed gypsy. Hence, anything in me different from a conventional Turkish child was her fault. For 3 months, fortunately, a good and beloved person had nursed me, and this gave the explanation of certain good traits. Whenever I was docile, gentle, or unselfish, it was attributed to my Nevdas Badger. Badger is the appellation for a Negro nurse, and I'm speaking through Halliday here. She calls her a Negro nurse, a black slave of my granny's who had married in Istanbul. In spite of her black face, she had a milk-white heart and had really nice manners. She had a respected position, and Granny visited her often and allowed her to take us one at a time to her house for long visits during Ramadan. So, as Halliday remembers it, she was not the only one for whom slave was an insult or an epithet. Halliday had unruly hair, and a visitor to the house teased her about it, but she refused to laugh. When the man saw that he could not tease me about my hair, he called me a little slave girl and swore that he had actually seen me brought from a slave dealer and actually knew the price that was paid for me, although he kept a mysterious silence on this point. Taking a step back from her childhood, Halliday contextualizes the situation and wrote, this was the identical nonsense which every little girl was teased in Turkey in those days. Yet every little girl minded it terribly, and some stupid ones, like me, almost believed it. This memory, shared with all former little Turkish girls of a certain age and class, offers a profound insight into the ways in which enslavement entered the lexicon of gender and mothering. The insult here is about value. He actually knew the price that was paid for me, although he kept a mysterious silence on this point. And that Halliday did not consider it ridiculous, although her adult narrating self wishes that she had, speaks to the power of this epithet. And in the next memory, Halliday literally has to work her way through a sense of threat and terror when an elite eunuch of one-time slave status has some fun with her. There in father's room, in front of his writing table and sitting in his chair, was a eunuch. As these people were familiar sights in the palace, the circumstance was not in itself strange. But this eunuch was different from the stately black men I was accustomed to. His face was a light milk and coffee color. His features were more regular than my own. His eyes were big and of the troubling kind, sad, humorous, and very beautiful. His large, handsome head was set on a crippled body with an enormous hunch on the back. I began walking around him in order to get a good view of the hunch, and then I stood and stared at him, fascinated. I believe there was the curve of a smile. In fact, there were many smile curves in the corners of his mouth, but he kept them under control and returned my gaze seriously for a time. Then he sighed and rolled his eyes, his face taking on an extraordinary look of real suffering. Ah, I'm waiting for my father, he said. Who is thy father? My father? He looked astonished. My father is Adib Bey, of course. He is my father, says Halliday. Well, I'm talking of Adib Bey too, but he is my father. At least he was. I was his son, his firstborn, and you, a black foundling from the streets, came and bewitched us both. I became crippled and black, and you white and took my place, and I was turned into the street. His face crumbled into lines, his voice sobbed, his eyes became full of tears, yet watched me furtively. I've never been torn so between such different sensations. Belief in my own wicked witchery, fear lest I might be found out, sent to the streets, and become a negress once more, pity for his miserable fate, and hatred toward him for making me feel all of this. I was trying hard to swallow the painful lump in my throat, to hold back the tears that already stood on my lashes. I needed the strength of a dozen buffaloes to keep my mouth from trembling in ever so many directions. He crawled toward me, gazed at me, and tried to kiss me. "Thou dear black witch," he said, as father entered the room, "what tricks are you playing on my little girl, Aga?" my father said. "Telling her not to steal the fathers of such poor orphans as me," he answered. Father laughed and took me on his knees, but did not trouble to explain what seemed a tragic dilemma to me. I carried a misgiving in my heart about this until its absurdity gradually made itself apparent to me. So racial identity is horrifyingly fluid to the little girl Halliday, and the possibility of not being her father's white child terrifying to her. It is also interesting to see how this joke unites Adib Bey, Halliday's father, and the Aga, clearly someone close to him, but never really identified. It makes both of them laugh. It is clear, too, though, that Halliday gave a lot of thought to constructions of race in her childhood when writing as an adult, in ways not imagined by Hoda Shadawi. I should say that she wrote these in English in 1924, 1925, where she was teaching at Columbia University, and who knows what she was experiencing of the Harlem Renaissance, because she was living right there. So I'm thinking it's interesting to explore her racial lexicography and compare it to Turkish. That might be an interesting place to go. Okay, anyway, this would just be about 3 more minutes. In her memoirs, Hoda Shadawi shared the closeness of slaves in her life without sharing their stories. Halliday also expressed in a different way that the stories of slaves were not terribly interesting to her, but one experience showed a slightly different case. She and her big sister received 2 Abyssinian girls bought in Yemen as gifts. And as Halliday described it, the little girl bought for her sister was not an interesting creature. But Reshe, the one bought for me, was as pretty as an Abyssinian girl could be. And I quote her now, "As a rule, I believe colored people have sad dispositions, but when they arrive in a foreign country as slaves, hardly speaking a word of its language, they must feel sad indeed. Granny used to say that Turkish chickens and Abyssinian children are the most delicate creatures in the world, and I thought of it as I saw Reshe blinking at us and looking around with what seemed more like fear than curiosity." Halliday remembered very clearly Reshe's first night in the household, and the image of her little sister, Niloufer, and Reshe staring at each other. Niloufer was frightened that Reshe would eat her. "Are you sure she's not a cannibal?" We were told a great many stories of cannibals, and their characteristics, according to our information, were 2 canine teeth sharper than other people, and they would have a tail. That's Halliday. So Halliday looked over at Reshe, who smiled strangely. Halliday remembered it as a grimace more than a smile. Still, she reassured her little sister that Reshe was not a cannibal. Years later, Halliday remembered when Reshe learned Turkish well enough to talk. It was most amusing to hear her impressions of the first night in my room. Reshe had heard in Yemen that the white people of Constantinople were in the habit of eating Abyssinians. Halliday also remembered Reshe's beautiful dancing and the song she would sing when she was happy and the song she would sing when she was sad. Halliday loved it. I never learned what this wonderful song meant, for by the time she learned Turkish, she had forgotten her own Abyssinian. But it had infinite pathos and longing. From it, I caught a glimpse of the misery of her past days before she was able to tell me about the ways in which she had been stolen with her little brother from a wonderful Abyssinian forest and made to walk for months under the lash of the slave dealers. There was that in her song, especially in the way that she sang it, which made one guess the dreary suffering through the meaningless words. The dreary suffering through the meaningless words. Whenever the oppression and weariness of life settled on my heart too heavily, I used to ask her to come to my room and sing me that song. Though we cannot hear that song, Halliday hums a little of Reshe's story. Then Halliday borrows the melody to the singer to help her express her own feelings. In somewhat of a conclusion to this story, Halliday promised Reshe she would grant her her heart's desire, which was to dress exactly as Halliday did. Halliday promised that when I was grown up and married and had a house of my own, I would see that she should have the same dresses as I did, as well as a servant and a nice room to herself. At the same time, I wrote her a liberating paper, worded exactly the way Granny told me she had written the liberating papers for her slaves, so that Reshe no longer technically belonged to me. I gave her this paper and told her to keep it in order to ensure her freedom in case I died and anyone else tried to sell her as if she was still a slave. Once free, Reshe remained in the household with Halliday, and when Halliday married, moved with her to her new home. As a young woman with babies of her own, Halliday observed that Reshe, quote, had developed into a fine colored lady, dressed in the latest fashion, proud of the attention she attracted, and always taking care to wear a thick veil and gloves, which caused her to be taken for a white woman with a beautiful figure. They grew into women together, and how did they catch her promise about the clothes? One wonders what Hoda would have thought, even more what Said Agha would have said. Thank you. So I guess I've left a couple of seconds for questions, huh?
Yes, that's terrific. Anybody have any questions? Mary?
Thank you. Terrific talk, and sort of opening up a side of Huda that maybe I should have been aware of if I read her memoirs, but had not been. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Muhammad Sultan Pasha's wives, concubines, if she was the only concubine, and then if she wasn't, what was the ethnicity of the others? And the thing that sort of surprises me about this story is that she's always been projected as very aristocratic, unquestionably in the top 0.05% of Egyptian society.
Right.
So what would the knowledge of Iqbal's not being from this stratum,
Right.
how would that, would that have impacted her own social status?
Right. Right. Oh, those are great questions. As far as the other concubines of Muhammad Sultan Pasha, I don't know. I know that she talks about people in the household, right, who have brought their families, but he dies by the time she's 5 years old. And the person who is really running the household, outside of the household, is of course her cousin, Ali Shadawi, and who has, by the way, his concubine, with whom he has several children. And is the fact that he is supposed to get rid of his concubine when he marries Hoda and doesn't, and has more children with them, with her, and this is a Sudanese concubine and not a Circassian concubine, and not a Abyssinian concubine, a Sudanese concubine. And that affected this family's sense of status, and very much. And when it was found out that he was still with this concubine, he loved this concubine, she left. And she was gone. She separated from the marriage for 7 years. And this is why Hoda became famous before Hoda became real, this was her first act. And so I don't know about Muhammad Sultan Pasha's other concubines. I would guess, and I really am guessing here, that he had others, but that they did not bear him children, and Iqbal was the one who bore him children, and it bore him a son. And so that brought her status, because he had another wife who was officially his wife, and Hoda only mentions one wife. So that's the first thing. And I just want to say, did you read Hoda's memoirs in Arabic or the translation in English? In Margot Badran's, right? Because there's a lot that's not in. I mean, that's a beautiful book, the translation. It would have taken forever to get everything else in there, and of course the memoirs are not completed, but there's a lot more about this in Arabic than there is in the English, which I found rather surprising. Now, your last question about had Iqbal's status been something that I do think it would have been. I think Iqbal knew that, and I think that she was also very concerned about inheritance. And the fact that the children were, of course, recognized as his, but that it just is never clear whether or not she married, that made her so vulnerable to Ali Shadawi. And so what's really cool about Iqbal, I think, is that she's the one who teaches Hoda how to open your mouth and protest, and she is the one who goes to bat for her daughter every inch of the way in this marriage. And of course they end up with a very companionate, not romantic, but companionate relationship, and children are born. So that's my reading of it, but you can hear me reading through some of the lines. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us something about the political context? What is the status of slavery in Egypt and Ottoman Turkey during the lives of these? My sense is that at some point slavery gets abolished in both of these countries. And so, and specifically, in the case of Haide, which is issuing manumission papers, what is the status of slavery?
Actually, in the time,
And what period are you talking about?
we're talking about, both of them were born in the, Hode was born in 1879, Halide, I believe, in 1884, I think that's correct. And so at that time, Egypt is pretty much independent from the Ottoman Empire, although its monarchy are connected, and Hode's family is connected through marriage. The slave trade was abolished in 1874. The slave trade, and it was made, and that was effectively moved. That had to be abolished by 1877. And when the British come in 1882, they set up manumission bureaus throughout Egypt and Sudan. But it is only Sudanese slave trade. Slavery is not abolished. All right, that is not abolished, and it is not abolished. And nobody says anything about Circassian slavery, although everybody knows it's going on. I mean, all this attention was being paid to it in the press about what was happening to Circassian women. But it was considered by British diplomats, men on the spot, said that if you went into this matter, you would never get anywhere with anybody in the Egyptian or the Ottoman political. So you would never get anywhere because everybody was married or had a concubine in their family. It was considered so intimate that in many ways this helps Lord Cromer, who becomes the proconsul of Egypt, shortly after 1882. This helps him decide that this is a despotic culture because marriage is the same as slavery, but it's not abolished. It's not formally abolished at this point. And to tell you the truth, I can't tell you on what day it was abolished in either country. It phases out for its own reasons, but it is not. This isn't. I would guess perhaps Ataturk had something to say, but because people didn't talk about it politically, they talked about it in literature. They talk about it. There's all of this late Ottoman literature in Turkish, which people. Ahmet Mithat is one of the people who have write novels about what it's like to be married, how similar it is to be slave. Georgie Zaidan has this very interesting novel about. I'm trying to remember the title of it, but he goes back to the 1840s to sort of describe a terrible situation for a woman and a loyal Sudanese slave and stuff. People talk about it in that way. It's not really until 1899 that Ahmed Shafiq, a lawyer, answers, I think it was Father Père Lavigerie in France. He's talking about how Islam is always about slave holding. But my sense is only the trade in African slaves is abolished. In fact, and when the British get to Sudan after 1898, and making all these claims that we have to abolish the slavery, they're so worried about vagrancy and prostitution, and they have this idea that all the slaves, former slaves, will become either prostitutes or beggars or bandits, that they don't abolish it. It doesn't happen in Sudan until well into the 20th century. So, does that answer your question?
This is a really rich set of stories, and I just love the way that you told them. Your prose is elegant.
Thank you.
The central theme that I detect in these stories is the ways in which these elite Ottoman women regarded household servants and slave servants, and especially Sudanese servants, as metaphors, metonyms, and also enforcers of these women's own ambiguous status in the household and in the nation. That there was a certain contagion continuously between slavery and the politically impaired or disempowered role of women. And the theme that keeps coming up that you didn't discuss extensively is the trope of beauty and ugliness, and the contrast between ugly appearance and inner character, which seems to correlate with the ambiguity of these Ottoman families within the history of these two nations. Are they still the old elite, or are they now the representatives of a nation state? So I wonder how specific this ambiguity or this contagion between the status of the slave and the wife is to this period, to this kind of family,
Right.
to this transitional epoch from the empire to the nation state, or how much is this more general? And secondly, I wonder if the men of these families felt any similar connection.
I'm gonna have to use that. I'm just about to revise this too, and so like tomorrow. So
Okay.
I have to put that in there. That makes a lot of sense about beauty and ugliness, and I have not addressed it directly. And I'm not sure, Randy, if I understood the second part, but I did understand the last part. So I'll ask you to repeat the second part. But let me just try. But did the men feel a similar contagion? No, they did not.
They never worried that they might have slave ancestors and that might affect their appearance, their character, their appropriate role in the nation.
Not the, or they didn't write about it. Or I haven't come across, I have yet to see. And I have to say the slave owner that I focus on, the few slave owners, male, that I focus on are Sudanese slave owners. And they're like, oh, no, my pedagogy, my genealogy is quite clear, and they could be born as slaves, it doesn't matter. It's from where their father comes. I mean, one of the people I write about is this guy, Badr, who ironically founded the first school for girls in Sudan, and he has these wonderful memoirs. They are hilarious, and they are brilliant. But when he talks about slaves, he's very clear, and he has slaves who help him and slaves he loves, but it's never contagious. Never. Now, he's coming from a different culture, okay? And he's also looking at his life as a very devout Muslim. He was a part of the Mahdi movement in 1881. But he is concerned about contagion for women, for his daughters. And that is interesting. And one of the fears when he founds his school is that there's some former slaves who have been educated by the British who would like to help teach, and he won't let them teach. He won't let them teach. And so part of that is outside of his fear of this is not going to look right. It's not right for the kids. It's not good for the girls. So I think your idea about contagion and gender is really. Now I missed the second part of it.
I think maybe the second part was, is this contagion that is
right.
that? Let's see. It reminds me of Louisiana Creoles who were trying to become elites in an Anglo-Saxon society, but
right.
who were always suspected of having African ancestors,
right.
or the contagion of Africanness through the wet nurses, for example.
Right.
And this kind of Ottoman family that was ambiguous, I mean, with roots at the center of the empire, but also intermarried with all sorts of other ethnic groups and trying to identify with the nation state. I'm wondering how much this fear of contagion was specific to a period when this kind of family status was so ambiguous.
I would say it's specific to this period. Because, the Ottoman Empire had been built on, its army had been built on slaves. Its viziers came from a meritocracy in which young boys and young women, but young boys were levied and then trained, and the most talented of them would become, big parts of the janissaries, and even the more talented would become the ministers of the state. You became an elite through slavery in many ways in the Ottoman Empire, so there wasn't that kind of shame in the game, if you will.
Were these castrated slaves?
No, they were a minority. They were a real small minority, and some of those actually also came from the Balkans, but they were very expensive. And the ones who came from Sudan, they were usually castrated at the age of 8 or 9 in Asyut, this town in Egypt, and then cared for by particular families until they were well, and the death rate was high. So as slavery gets more expensive over the 18th and the 19th, by the end of the 19th, it's too expensive. So these are real, side aga would not be repeated, in the early 20th century.
Thank you.
First off, thanks again for the talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I think like Bruce, I very much enjoyed your first book too. So
Double thank you.
I am intrigued by what I see as kind of these almost racial inversions going on between some of these different groups going on here, and that's to say that to the west, these Circassian slaves are viewed as white, and thus maybe they shouldn't be enslaved in some immoral way or whatever. publicity about the Circassian slave trade or something
Right.
like that. And yet,
Right.
when we look at it from the Turkish perspective in particular, the Albanians are seen almost as the lowest,
Right.
right? And that
Yeah.
that's where contamination comes from, whereas the blacks infuse sweetness or
In Holiday's case,
into the
in terms
women,
of, yeah,
into their whatever their wet nurse subjects.
yeah.
And so I'm curious if those inversions are coming from some kind of definitional distinction, that is, definitions of what race is, of what ethnicity is, in these different groups, that is to say the Ottomans
Yes.
versus kind of your standard Western European.
Right.
And also I wonder if this different view of the blacks among the Turks particularly,
Right.
if that is kind of the standard trope of the black as simple, the black as sweet, the black as a child, and thus able to pass on those childlike characteristics to another child and thus make that child happier in some way. So I'm just curious about your thoughts as to the root of these distinctions.
Right. Right. That's a great point. I'm so great a point. I'm going to have to try to answer it. I talk about this in other places in this raw thing I'm calling my book, but they do change over time. And so I would say what makes Halliday interesting to me is that she's not only defining people by their sort of military, like sort of the categories of the military game. Like the Ottomans were really good at deciding who were good fighters, right, based on ethnicity, and the Albanians were really unruly and basically barbarians, and boy could they fight, right? And people in the Balkans, and people here, people in the Caucasus, the people in the Caucasus are almost as denigrated as, pagan slaves coming from the heart of Sudan, all right, or even not Sudan, places where, because at least in Sudan, Islam had touched, right? But those Caucasians were considered to be wild and uncivilized and not civilizable, particularly the men, which is sort of interesting. So you had to get them early, otherwise they were lost, which is sort of interesting. And yet I think that, and maybe it's hard to prove this, so I'll just toss this at you and see what you think. I think that for the Sudanese, that for someone like her, wet nurse, okay, they know her, they like her, this and that. But there are other examples where a lot of the sense they have of black people comes from the Sudanese slave market. So like the terminology that the Egyptians and the Ottomans build up, to me I don't see its origins in the Ottoman world. I see its origins in the Sudan. And that people, as they bought the slaves, they bought the lingo, because they had to know how to value the slaves in some kind of way. Whereas, and so I think that different kinds of ways of the different forced migrations had their different, because of the circumstances that made each different, those circumstances also made the appellation or the ethnic appellation or the racial appellation a little different, because, also if you look at the difference between how people were defined as Sudanese and how Ethiopians were defined, and the Ethiopians were always defined differently, as close to Circassian women as you could get.
I mean, is that just to follow up, is that distinction a result of the political differentiation there? I mean, Abyssinia or Ethiopia or whatever has long been considered this great kind of cradle of civilization, at least among Western writers.
Right.
And certainly the Sudan, maybe not so much.
Right.
So I'm curious if that is that the root of that?
No, I think it came from the slave market. I really do. Not just, I mean, also, remember, they knew Sudanese kings. They knew, they had, especially in Egypt. But I think a lot of this comes from, now probably not so much the Nile Valley trade, but the Red Sea trade. And because these girls were sold in Yemen, and that's often what happens. So then you have the marketplace definitions coming from Yemen. And these are definitions that were established in guilds. They had guilds in Istanbul, guilds in Cairo for the slave traders. So this terminology was institutionalized, so yeah, I'm going to stand by that answer. I do think it's the slave trade.
Well, use my colleague to ask one last question, and somebody else wants to jump in. So this is a really interesting and rich set of stories, as Randy said. I recently read Beth Barron's latest book about the connection between sort of women's movement and the Egyptian national movement.
Right.
She makes much of the point, much of the point that this is basically the same thing, that to be pro-woman was to be pro-modern, which was be Egyptian nationalist, which was, right, there was this whole way of being modern that a lot of people like Sharawi imagined. And their memoirs serve that purpose, right? They're part of that argument. And so I'm understanding that slavery is probably also part of that argument.
Right.
But it's not totally clear to me precisely how. I mean, I can see how slavery is something to be, it's not considered by these writers who maybe are looking towards Europe. It's not considered to be a characteristic of a modern nation. You know, we need to raise our children by being better mothers, and that means that we shouldn't have slaves that should be in the harem, etc.
Right.
So then, if that's the case, I mean, maybe I should ask that: is that in fact the case? Is that evidence? Is there kind of tripartite, gender, modernization, and slavery as somehow connected here as part of the same process? If that is true, though, are these memoirs justifications or apologies for the slavery that was obviously part of people's lives? I mean, when they remember the kind of domestic slavery that they had in these elite households, I mean, how much veracity do you think we should give to these accounts? I mean, maybe ultimately we can't know, but I wonder to what extent this is, because there is, of course, later a set of apologies that emerge in the Middle East about slavery being a kind of didactic process and relatively gentle compared to the world versions of it. Do we see the beginning of that emerging out of this, or is it? I mean, what exactly is the purpose of these treatments? Or maybe they're just memoirs.
Well, they are memoirs. They have to be taken with that memoir grain of salt.
Yeah.
I don't know how much veracity there is. I'm not, and to be honest with you, Bruce, I'm not worried about it. I'm interested in how they remember it, not whether it's right. It's how they remembered it. But I think you're right, as Beth says. I mean, setting it up as being gendered in the modern nation and slavery. I agree with her. I quoted her a lot. I agree with her about that. But what I think is interesting is I don't see this in the narratives of the men as much. That they're trying to prove their modernity, not necessarily the men around them. Like what is the most important. I think that what Hoda is saying, and to a great extent Halliday also, is that our country will never be right unless marriage gets better, and we are examples of that. And look, and yet there's all this nationalist pride, like Hoda's like, I mean, because I freed myself of this, we can become a modern nation. But she was politically compromised as well. Nobody talked more about recolonizing the Sudan than Hoda Sha'awi. I mean, she was, and Halliday, she wasn't taught. She freed her slaves. She doesn't launch this big manumission thing for these Turks of African descent who are obviously the children of slaves, etc. So I think they're using themselves as sort of cultural bridges, and they're doing it with a kind of vanity in a way, to show that they embody the, as Beth puts it, Egypt as a woman, that they embody this, but it's not for the slaves, it's for them. It's very much for them. Does that answer?
Yeah, it's just kind of a accoutrement
I
to
think
their
so.
story.
Yeah.
And it does seem to present slavery as gentle, and I would read that as a metaphor of the way that these elites, once they became national elites, were perfectly comfortable with class haunt and extreme forms of it. Even as they were liberating themselves as modern women.
Oh, absolutely. That issue continued to haunt Egypt throughout the 20th century. And we could say they're readdressing it right now. Yeah. But I'll just say this and then I'll stop. They never compromised. Neither of these women ever taught. They always admit how hard that transition from enslavement, from freedom to enslavement was. Always. And comparing them to some of the men who wrote, and then comparing them to slaves who wrote about it, they got that. They did hear that.
That's great.
Thank you all so
Thanks
much.
very much for coming.
Thank you so much.
There's a reception right outside. You can take advantage.